Hello, everybody. Because we're recording, we are basically going to ask you today, if you don't mind, to not show video, just because it makes it slightly trickier. So if you don't mind just basically taking yourself off video, that's extremely kind. We will, at the end, ask you all to sort of come back for a conversation which we won't be recording. But if you don't mind if you don't mind us basically taking you off the recording just for today, because we are going to be putting this up on YouTube afterwards, because we've had lots of requests from people who can't attend. So apologies for not letting you all see one another, but I hope you all got the email earlier on which says that you definitely need another device, because we do want you to share your impressions, answer lots of questions, and do lots of other interactive things on a service called menti.com, which we will get going with. Right, so first and foremost, a huge thanks to Julian for sharing with us his inspiration and his love of craft chocolate, and in particular for writing a fantastic book on the wonderful world of Babette's Feast, which is a fantastic movie, which I'm sure most of you well, hopefully will have seen it. And if not, we will hopefully inspire you all to go and see it. Just a little bit about the format of today. This is not quite the same as the normal Welcome to the Revolution tasting that we do. We will be eating lots of different chocolate, but it's basically a little bit more about sort of trying to see some of the lessons learned from Babette's Feast and how they apply to craft chocolate. And that's what Julian will be doing. Whereas I will be trying to cover a little bit the history and a little bit about how to taste craft chocolate and everything else like that. So Julian, I don't know if you've got any opening remarks which you'd like to sort of advise people on how to do things, or should we just head straight in?
Head straight in your capable hands.
Excellent. So the first question is, as you all know from watching Babette's Feast, it's a little bit about sort of, the role of religion, but it's also about the role of food and how sort of amazing food can sort of change you almost in a spiritual way, which Julian's going to go into more. But before we did that, just to sort of warm up and get you all sort of going, Julian will tell you a little bit more about the story in Babette's Feast, and then we're going to have a little quiz.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, Babette's Feast is based on a short story by Karen Blixen, best known perhaps for Out of Africa because of the film. And it's an extraordinary short story, an extraordinary film. And in fact, the film is remarkably faithful to that short story. It's really, really closely follows it. But the film somehow brings it to life. And it's a piece of magic. The director, Axel, can't remember his surname, it was really his only hugely successful film, best foreign language Oscar and everything. And it was really a labor of love for him, a pet project. And it just all came together. Now, what I think is most interesting, the basic story of the film, it's got a various sort of backstories and it's quite complex in some ways, but in essence, it's quite simple. A French chef, a female French chef, basically flees France and goes to work as the housekeeper to a pair of Puritan sisters, people who eat very simple, basic porridge and nothing more. And then, having won the lottery by some sort of strange twist of fate, she inherits a huge amount of money, which she spends on a one-off feast for the members of this religious community, who regard it all as sinful, horrible, but by the end, perhaps their hearts are softened by all of this. As a story, as a plot, just put that way, may not sound that interesting, but I think as we'll see throughout the tasting, if you know the film, there's so much more to it than that.
Right. Let's start by just getting you warmed up on Menti, and somebody's already had a quick go at doing this one. What you need to do to get onto menti.com is you just basically take your phone and you just type in menti.com to any sort of website that you can, and then you need the numbers 97, 19, 37, and 1. And I'm sorry, somebody actually sort of phoned me earlier or called me earlier to ask me about the numbers. And I think I may have given you the wrong numbers. So apologies if I've done that. You'll need to log in again, but it's pretty simple. It's 97193731. When you do that, it basically will just show you the same pages as we're looking at. And what we just want to know is just basically, let's put this in context. What do we think we do more in terms of sort of, like eating chocolate, praying, or believing in God? So sort of, let's just sort of see what different numbers people have got there. Okay, I mean, this is more just to sort of warm you up and just get you to use Menti. We will show you in a sec what the answer is, but you're all doing pretty well. And then we're just going to sort of put this slightly more into context. So let me just do the spoiler and just sort of show you the numbers on this. So what it actually is that 25% of Brits eat chocolate at least once a day. 75% of us eat it every week. So we actually spend more on books than we do on, we spend more on chocolate than we do on books and music combined. And then there's about a third of us who believe in God, and then slightly confusingly, about 42% of us who pray. So sort of quite how you reconcile those two is another set of statistical anomalies. But it just shows you the importance of food. And so chocolate, we think, is an amazing food. And that's what we really wanted to sort of get you into today. And we just want to give you a tiny bit of the history of chocolate, because what you may or may not realize is that we've actually been drinking chocolate for at least 5,000 years. We can date it back to a bit of Peru, Ecuador and northern Peru, called Santa Ana de Florida. It was extremely valuable. By the way, there is a quiz at the end, so that you want to be sort of taking a little bit of attention to some of the stuff that we talk about, both about the book and about the history and different bits of chocolate, because there are prizes to be won at the end. But anyway, look, chocolate is a drink. It's so valuable that it's sort of used as a store of currency by lots of different people. And then above and beyond that, it's used to do things like, for example, fatten up male warriors for a year, so that you could sacrifice them and then make certain that the gods made certain that that the sun would rise the next day. And you'd mix it with all sorts of different spices. But it is very, very much Thea Brahma cacao, the food of the gods. It's all about religion to the Aztecs and to the Mayans and to the Olmecs and everybody else. And interestingly, that sort of chocolate, however, is radically different to any chocolate that we would normally eat today, although we do have some of it to go. And what we'd love you to basically start by doing is just by taking this chocolate, which is, you've got it in front of you. And one thing we probably didn't tell you at the outset, which is a bit naughty, is that some of these chocolates we think you will love, but some of them you may find slightly Marmite-like, and a few of them you may find slightly challenging. So what I'm going to ask you to do is try that chocolate, and then what we'd love you to do is just basically describe it on Menti. What we'll also then do a little bit is just talk a little bit more about this chocolate. But anyway, so this is crafted in Somerville, Massachusetts, by a great guy called Alex Whitmore, who's one of the ex-founders of Zipcar. And you can get from the texture that this is radically different to any of the chocolates that you're used to getting sort of today or in any other formats. So sweet, grainy, absolutely what we sort of expect you to be sort of getting from it. Julian, thoughts? I know that this is a chocolate which you sometimes love and sometimes are slightly puzzled by, but it's sort of an acquired taste.
I really love it. I think I really, really love it. And I think it's interesting. I mean, this is in some ways a very sort of crude chocolate. The process of making it is not bang up to date. The history of the development of chocolate making techniques is, of course, interesting and rich. But even in Babette's feast, what people most remember is the lavish feast at the end, with all these quails and real turtles, not a mock turtle soup. Very extravagant ingredients, expensive stuff. But actually the film is more about, in a way, the essence, the joys of everyday eating. And Babette is actually very, very skilled, as we see here. This is a picture of her gathering herbs. She's given little money. She's asked to cook things simply. But by really understanding ingredients, she both reduces the household expenditure on food and makes it much, much nicer. And the kind of food she's making day in, day out is not the restaurant food she used to make. It's simple, everyday food. And I think that's a really important lesson, because, if we think of food as being part of the good life, I mean, if by good food we mean those special meals, it's not part of the good life in any everyday sense. It's about the simple things of every day. And one of the great sort of aesthetic principles which allows us to make the most out of life is to have that sort of joy in simplicity. And the thing about simplicity, of course, though, is simplicity is not the same as easy. It's actually very difficult sometimes to get real beauty out of simple things. Babette is able to do it. And by God, I think these chocolate makers do it. I'm interested, this is a Marmite chocolate, because I always really love this one. And that slightly sort of sandiness, almost graininess, is just makes it interesting, I think.
It does. It's interesting, though, that most of us are struggling with getting too much flavor out of it, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And I think we're now going to basically go on about how, the art of cooking, and basically by again, for those of you who did not like that chocolate, you're going to probably enjoy the next one even less than I think you're about to go on to, which is what we now like you to do is just basically talking about the simplicity. We're now going to give you some pure 100% chocolate. So we've not given you the big bar here. What you've got in front of you is a small square of an amazing 100% chocolate by a guy called Francois Pralou and his son. And they've been making chocolate for at least sort of 70 years in their family firm and everything. The beans come from Madagascar. I should warn you, however, that this is going to be a little bit like the first time, if any of you sort of can cast your minds back to the first time you ever had an espresso coffee, it probably slightly puzzled you. And what I mean by that is that, we'll talk a bit more about taste and flavor in a moment, but actually this is actually, you're going to get a different sensation, which is what we'd normally call astringency. So it is extremely challenging to the palate because of the tannins which are in it. And in a way, Julian, sort of, when we were talking about it earlier, one of the great things, well, I'll let you talk about this dish, Julian, because I can never pronounce the name of it either.
Ulebrod.
Yeah.
Anyone speaks any sort of Danish, you can correct me on that. It's basically a beer porridge. It's sort of stale bread and beer, and it's all cooked up, and it's the most, well, if it's done well, like a lot of simple things, it's meant to be delicious. Here it looks like it's done very badly indeed. I think it's what's interesting about the way this kind of relates to this 100% praless, as an unsophisticated person like me would say, pralu, is 100% chocolate is very, very interesting, and there are some really good stuff out there. And I remember a while back when I was sort of trying to see how far I could go with reducing sugar. So I tried a lot of 100%, and some are pretty good. But the truth is, I think if most people are honest, hardly anyone would say their preferred chocolates are 100%. I do quite high percentages actually, around 80, 85, 100. It's really, really not my favorite. And I think it's sort of, in a way, it's a moral about the problems of excessive purity driving for too much purity. Too much purity is very rarely a good thing. You need to add something to the cacao in order to really get the pleasure out of it. You need sugar normally, at least some other sort of spices and things like that. And I think, again, in Babette's Feast, this is sort of dramatized. The Puritanism of the parishioners there is just too much. It's too much. They're seeking a sort of a holy life, but actually in their purity, it takes them further away from goodness because it makes them less than human. It hardens their hearts. It prevents them from enjoying the conviviality of good company with each other. And they end up becoming quite a fractious community. And it takes the food and drink really to soften their hearts and bring them together. Interestingly enough, I don't think this is an anti-Christian message, actually. It's anti a very specific form of Christianity. The former Pope, or is it the present one even? No, the former one was, he once said before he was Pope that the Babette's Feast was his favorite film. And talking about it, he said how it demonstrated the dangers of this excessive Puritanism. And I think Catholicism, it has its extremes, certainly in certain monastic orders, but generally Catholic countries they're more relaxed about pleasure than a lot of Protestant ones. And I think that's significant. I think that is important. And I think, in terms of the very teachings of the community, one thing I like about the film is that at various points you hear the teachings of the founder of this religious community. And I think what the film often shows is not that they're necessarily wrong. It's that sometimes they are, but often they're not wrong. It's just that they are misapplied. So, for example, one of the expressions is that, that the greatest thing we can take from life is what we give away. So this message that it is by giving that we really receive. To give is to receive. And that's true. But of course, because they're so puritanical, they never really give anything of value at all. The person who gives the most in the whole film is Babette. She gives her entire fortune to this village in order, well, actually, not just so they can have a good meal, but also that she can express her creativity once again, which is an interesting motivation. So, purity, the too much of the pursuit of purity is not good for us, which is a very important message in the days of clean eating and all these bogus messages about being excessively rigid.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit more about the facial expressions that you're now sort of seeing. And if you were all able to see one another, I guess that quite a few of you, especially those of you who are not used to 100%, would probably be looking a little bit like this. And at the risk of sort of getting a bit technical, we'll try and explain to you why that is. And Julian started by sort of saying that actually what makes chocolate sort of more approachable for most people is actually a little bit of sugar. And that's right. We've understood this for quite a bit of time. There's a great quote from Mrs. Beaton when she basically sort of says, what salt is to meat, sugar is to fruits and chocolate. And she's right, it brings it out. And the reason why it does this is that basically you have inside chocolate what you also have inside red wine or in coffee, which are polyphenols, and in particular, you have tannins. And tannins work by basically sucking the saliva out of your mouth. And they basically dry it out, and they also activate something called your trigeminal nerve, which sort of runs down from your eye down to your mouth. And that's what gives you this sort of drying sensation. So what I forgot to tell you all before you have that chocolate is you really need some water, or even better, some wine actually to drink while you have it. But I do think actually that as you get used to this, it's a bit like espresso, or even having a whiskey or something, which is the first time you have it, you think, what is everybody going on about? And then you gradually get into it. So I would sort of slightly differ with Julian in the sense that there are some real, hardcore 100% fanatics and real sort of zealots who do really love it. And it is an amazing way of actually sort of watching the chocolate maker's art, because you've got to be very, very good to make a very good 100%. And you've got to know how to sort of grind it and how to add the cocoa butter and everything else like that. But it is, for most of us, quite difficult to approach. But that's actually true of lots of other products. So, my favorite example is specialty coffee, where, there are all these amazing coffee stores. Like, we're very fortunate, we're next to one called Proofrock in Leather Lane. But even if you go to these amazing specialty coffee stores where people spend, anything from like £3 to, £20 on a cup of coffee, which is great value and it's all great. But like 80% of the coffee they sell has got milk in it because people cannot deal with astringency. So anyway, the good news is we're not going to have any more 100% chocolate as we go through. What we are now going to be talking about a little bit more is we're back to the movie. And Julian, so we're over to you a little bit more now.
Yeah, I mean, here is this problem, because we're talking about chocolate, and chocolate's a very pleasurable thing, particularly the really great chocolate that Spencer and Co. sell to us. And I think that in this film, we see this very common trope is exaggerated in this Puritan community, but particularly in Christianity, but also in lots of other religions. There is this real suspicion of bodily pleasure as being sinful. At one point, the sister has a dream in which Babette is effectively out to kind of poison everyone and kill them. She's a kind of a witch, frankly, which is pretty awful. I think it's very interesting why religions promote that. I think a lot of people would assume it's because there is a belief in the soul as being separate from the body, and the things of the body are less important than things of the soul, and a distraction from it. And I think there is a lot to it. There's a lot to that. Sometimes that is the case. But I think there are better reasons why a lot of religious traditions are suspicious of bodily pleasure. And that's because the problem with pleasure is that it's very easy to sort of become its slave. So if you think about the kind of chocolate most people eat, and Spencer will talk more about this later, basically it's the kind of chocolate that when you eat it, you just want to have more. And it makes you gluttonous, it makes you greedy, you binge out on it, and so forth. So when it comes to pleasure in the good life, there's always this debate, is pleasure the ultimate good? Is happiness the ultimate good? I don't think pleasure is the ultimate good, but pleasure is a good. But the trick is to enjoy it and to let pleasure be something that you, as it were, are in control of, and not the other way around. As long as you're not the slave to your desires, as long as pleasure isn't kind of leading you like a dog on a leash where it wants to go, it's very, very proper. But I also think the other problem, going back to the soul and body thing, is that the denial of pleasure, I think, is tied up with the denial of our essential corporeality, our animality. What's offensive to a lot of people about people enjoying food and drink is that it seems to them too close to the animals. And even philosophers like Aristotle, who was really a brilliant philosopher, even he had that prejudice. He thought, that it expressed what we had in common with the animals, whereas our higher nature is to think. And I think what really good food does in particular is it shows us why that whole view is fundamentally mistaken, because there is nothing vulgar and animal-like about really good food. By the way, as you would have seen, this names always escape my mind. It'll come to me later. Brillat-Savarin, I think it was, the French writer, said that animals feed, but the human being eats. There's a difference between feeding, as an animal does, and really eating. And eating is really about appreciation, and there's skill in the cooking and all of these things. And it's about sociability, it's about awareness of where things come from. So actually the pleasures of really good food show us both our connection with animals, in that it is rooted in the physical, it's rooted in the biological, rooted in the carnal. But it is so much more than that as well, because it requires creativity, imagination, thought, and sociability to make any of these things. So, don't let anyone tell you that interest in chocolate shows you're not of a high mind. I'd say au contraire, the people who want to deny bodily pleasures have anything to do with being living the life of the mind or the higher thing do not understand actually how involved and interesting and really human good food is.
Yeah, I mean, what we're actually going to do in a sec is we're going to quickly just run you through how we get to chocolate bars. But I'm going to pick up on this theme that Julian's talked about, which actually sort of this sort of why are we so suspicious about our bodily senses, in particular eating food, whereas actually we're fine with using logic or seeing stuff and stuff like that. Anyway, before we do that, just to quickly just give you the history. Europe discovers chocolate thanks to Columbus, brings it back, discovers it on his third voyage. And again, the bizarre thing about chocolate hitting Europe is that, again, it's because of religion that it actually takes off. So just as the Aztecs use it for religious purposes, it's actually used extensively for religious purposes in Europe. And the reason for this is that it's a little bit odd now that we think of Lent and giving things up for Lent. But if you go back to Renaissance, medieval, Reformation times, 100 days plus of the year were what were called fasting days. So it was very limited in what you could eat. But what the Jesuits discovered pretty quickly was that actually you could drink chocolate and it's very nutritious and it's very filling. And so they promoted it as something you could have on fasting days. And they had all sorts of different popes, from Gregory XIII, who's the guy here, to the sort of, I don't know whether you're left or right, whatever it is, but the first guy you can sort of see. And he was very pro this, but it took about another 200 years for Alexander, the whatever his name is, to basically say, yes, actually, it's all okay. But basically, in the Catholic Church, the super cool thing to have, basically brought to you, whether you're sort of undergoing mass or you're at church, especially on fasting days, is your drinking chocolate. And it spreads so that basically when you get to, things like Lloyd's of London opening up, that's just not just a coffee house, it's also a chocolate house, as are things like White's of London, all these famous clubs. And in fact, I think we have with us today, one of the great things about chocolate is it's such an aristocratic product. So I think we've got Tossier with us today. And they, they're named after one of the three people who had keys to King George I's bedchamber, because they were his personal chocolate maker. And it's a great story, and it shows how aristocratic chocolate is and how much it's spreading and doing really, really well. But then there is a small problem with chocolate, which is all to do with beards and cocoa butter. And very quickly, it explains basically what happens with chocolate and why you have that taza that you've just enjoyed, because that's the move basically, which I will now outline, which is the problem with drinking chocolate, is that cocoa butter is magical in lots of different ways, like it melts beautifully in your mouth. But one of its biggest problems is that it does not combine well with water or milk or anything else. In fact, it congeals pretty gruesomely. So if you are basically a Dutchman living in 18th or 19th century Europe, or a Brit, and it's pretty cold outside, and you take a swig of hot chocolate, what happens is it gets stuck in your beard and sometimes in your ruff, and then it congeals, and it's distinctly unpleasant for these guys. So them being very sort of prim and proper and wanting to sort of do everything right, the Dutch spend about 100 years trying to find ways to get the cocoa butter out of the chocolate and somehow or other stop it getting into their beards. And eventually a father and son team called the Van Houtens invent this contraption you can see in the middle, which is called the cocoa press. And they work out that you can actually squeeze the cocoa butter, which is about 50% of what's in a cocoa bean, out, and then there's less of it to get stuck in your beards. And then somehow, counterintuitively, in the most bizarre way, Joseph Fry in Britain, in Bristol, in the 1840s, works out how to add cocoa butter back to the stuff that we were using to make drinks and actually start to make solid bars. But they are much, much more like the Taza bar that you had here. So they're much grittier and they're much grainer. Because what you really need is for the next revolution to take place, which is when we're going to get into milk chocolates and everything else. But it's really the Swiss who sort of bear the standard and responsibility for all this. And there are sort of like lots of different stories to do with it. But the fundamental one is that there's a guy called Rudolf Lindt who one weekend apocryphally leaves his machines running and discovers how to turn this grainy chocolate into this very smooth stuff. And there are two effects to this smoothness, one of which is it melts in a very different way. But the second one, which is that if you grind chocolate for a long time, what you actually do is you release more of the polyphenols and it brings out the flavors. It's a bit like kneading bread. So that's the first great thing the Swiss do. And then the second thing is there's a guy called Daniel Peter and his better known mate called Henri Nestle, who work out that you can actually add milk into chocolate. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about the bliss point. But that's really what takes chocolate off. So in the 1850s, sadly, chocolate, in the 1800s, chocolate is basically, very, very much second tier because of the cost to tea or to coffee. But after the 1850s, when you can get bars, and in particular after the 1880s, when you can get milk chocolate in this lovely smooth Swiss style, that's when you start to see chocolate really taking off. So that's when people like Cadbury start emerging. However, there is a real downside to all of this chocolate. And that's most easily explained by, we all know about how wonderful Bourneville is, but what you may not be aware of is that at the same time as Cadbury's are sort of running Bourneville, they are basically sourcing most of their cacao, as is everybody else at this period, by the way, too, from two little islands called São Tomé and Príncipe, just off the coast of West Africa. The problem here is that it's not indigenous to those islands. Nobody really wants to do this work. So the solution which the Portuguese work out is to basically use slave labor. And this is all absolutely lethal and all absolutely horrific. There's a great investigative journalist called Joseph Nevinson who spends like 7 or 8 years of his life documenting this. There's a massive court case with the Evening Standard in 1906 against Cadbury, and there's a whole boycott São Tomé movement. But it really is a distinctly unpleasant side to what's happening as you sort of turn chocolate into these sort of mass-produced bars. And really what happens to chocolate is it becomes a commodity. Nobody really thinks about chocolate. So the easiest way to think about it is you take something like Cadbury's Chocolate Orange, one of the oldest established brands. That's not really about the chocolate. The chocolate gives it the mouthfeel, but chocolate is just another ingredient, like the sugar or like the sort of the vegetable fats which are inside it. And chocolate really just becomes something which you use almost as sort of like a source of energy or a little bit of a snack. But you don't really enjoy chocolate for the reasons why we think you should enjoy chocolate. What we basically get to is people just enjoying chocolate more for what we're about to talk about, which is this extraordinary idea of the bliss point. So one of the things which the Swiss discovered accidentally with Lindt and Nestle was actually documented much more effectively in the 1960s by a guy called Howard Moskowitz, who is best known for Pringles, not just for Doritos. And the way to sort of think about what he's talking about with food is to basically think of the Pringles logo, or the Snacks tagline, which is, once you pop, you can't stop. And if you think about it, that is true of most sort of processed, ultra processed foods. They're all about just trying to make you scoff it and have more of it. And it's based on the discovery that even though human beings like salt, they like sugar, and they like fat, generally we know when we've had too much of any one of those. However, if you combine all three together and you give it a bit of a snap in something like a Pringle or in something like a Dorito, you basically, as a human being, you just don't know when to stop. So most of us will know when to stop when we're eating, pardon me if you're into the vegetarian, but like nobody can really eat a huge, 3 whole steaks. It just doesn't happen. Whereas we could just basically carry on eating a box of Pringles until we can't stop. And actually milk chocolate, unfortunately, is a little bit like that. And I'm not criticizing milk chocolate, and we'll talk more about it as we go through, but it is this sort of, side of food, which is gaming people in a very, very unsatisfactory way. And it's partly because we don't spend enough time thinking about actually how to savor food. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the fundamental problem with turning chocolate into a commodity is that what happens is you just turn it into another way of stuffing calories into people and getting people just to eat too much too fast. And what we would like people to do is slow down, savor, do more of what Babette's feast is all about.
We're going to eat some more in a minute, aren't we? Do you want to eat some more, or do you want to talk first?
Well, we could start this chocolate, the Pura Porcelana. And do you want to before we do that, do you want me just to sort of get everybody to sort of play the game with their nose and get into taste and flavor?
Yeah, go on, do that. Let's do it.
So you've got a little pink bar in front of you, or maybe a big pink bar with a butterfly on it if you've got the big one. But I think it's probably a little one. I'm hoping. Yep, Julian's got it there too. What I want you to do is something a little bit wacky. Bear with me. I don't want you to do what you normally do with chocolate, which is sort of, hear the snap, give it a quick sniff and everything else like that. What I want you to do is break it, but I want you to hold your nose and just stick it on your tongue and just let it melt. But you have to be holding your nose as you do this. So even Julian, you have to be holding your nose or else it's not going to work.
I've done it before. I don't know. Go on.
Oh, you have done it before. That's true. We make everybody do this with all of our Welcome to Revolutions. But what should be happening now is, other than you asphyxiating, the other thing that should be happening is you might be getting a little bit of a nice melt on your mouth. You might be getting a little bit of sweetness. But when I ask you to release your nose, suddenly there should be a whole euphoria, an orchestra of flavors just bursting all through you. And this is because what actually happens when you have something like chocolate is you get both taste and flavor. So Julian was sort of saying that, we sort of regard eating as a sort of very low art, but actually it's incredibly complicated and it's incredibly important what we do and how we do it. So that if you basically think about it, we've got taste, which we all know. is a series of receptors, but they're not just on our tongue, by the way. They're also in our mouth, all the way down our throat. They actually go down to our gut, in our esophagus, etc., etc. And that's where you detect things like sweetness, sourness, saltiness, bitterness, also something called umami, and also you get the metallic taste from this as well. But these are radically different to what you actually think of as flavor. So flavor is something you get through your sense of smell, your olfactory sensor, but you get it in two different ways. You get it one through what's called orthonasal olfaction, which is when you smell something, but then also you get it through what's called retronasal olfaction. This also is basically your sense of smell, your olfactory sensor, detecting different flavors. But you get these flavors through the back of your mouth. And the great thing about chocolate, back to the wonders of cocoa butter, is that it melts when you put it in your mouth and you just savor it. And this is what we really sort of love you all to do. But before I do that, I've got one more little trick to do with you, which is just do me a favor, eat a piece of chocolate like that incredibly fast, and just tell us what you think of it. But you should have finished it by now. Incredibly fast, just like literally scoff it. Pretend it's a bar of dairy milk. Eat it that fast. Like just not more than 3 or 4 seconds, and just tell us what sensations you got out of it, if any. You know, and just sort of see what you get. Okay, but you should have all finished it by now. Bitter, cold, yep, that's what I want. But just basically buttery, sharp. Okay, excellent. Now stop for a sec. That's it, because you should have all swallowed. Just swallow that piece of chocolate in your mouth. We've given you a piece of paper which was developed by a wine expert who's an amazing buyer called Rebecca Palmer from Corney and Barrow, a great coffee expert, a guy called James Hoffman, who's Square Mile, coffee shop we talked about before, world barista champion, and another guy called Professor Barry Smith, who's a colleague of Julian's, a philosopher, but who also does a lot with taste. But the reason why we show this to you is because actually, when you savor products, which are proper foods and not just designed to hit you up front, what should happen is you should sort of, it's a bit like surfing a wave. You should basically sort of go on a journey. And the first thing you should get is basically texture and a little bit of melt, and maybe a little bit of taste. And then as you sort of, the wave sort of starts to break upon you, you should then get lots of different flavor notes hitting you. So, you know, jamminess, earthiness, spiciness, brightness, whatever. And then afterwards, after about 10 to 20 seconds, you should start to get everything from astringency to balance to length, complexity. So we want you to sort of go on this sort of wave-like journey. But the other angle that we really want you to think a little bit about here is that Julian said earlier on that when we were sort of talking about the basic senses, because of Aristotle, because of Kant, and because of everybody else, we basically ignored taste and flavor for a long time. So most of us are really good at describing music. You know, we can also talk about the pitch, the beat, the rhythm, the beat, or anything else like that. Similarly with color, we can actually all basically describe a painting. And even if you're colorblind, actually you could use something like, you know, a prism and refract it, and you can actually work out what the different colors are. We've got really clear measurements, really clear words, and really easy ways to articulate it. But with taste and flavor, most of the time, we're not very practiced at it, and we don't even really have a standard vocabulary. So we're not going to try and force you to say anything you know, by sort of auto-suggesting, and this is all anonymous. But what we would love you to do is, sometimes you've got words on the tip of your tongue. So we basically just give you this crib sheet, thanks to people like Rebecca and James, as you go through the different stages. And they sometimes just help you articulate what it is that you're detecting as you go through. So what we'd love you to do now is take a little bit of that pura porcelana and savor it. And while we do that, while you're savoring it, I'm going to go back to this page in a minute. So just while you're savoring it, just think of the words you're going to use to describe it. Julian is going to talk through very quickly the page that I should have had here, which is the page of, well, I'll let you talk about the general and how he's enjoying the dinner, but you can sort of get the picture. And then, Julian, do you mind if I go back to the page where we can sort of put up what they're savoring, and you can talk about this bit of the movie?
No problem at all. Well, it's a wonderful bit of the movie. It's obviously the climactic feast in which the Puritans are slowly. They basically vowed to be as though the food didn't exist, to not taste it, to not be aware of it, so they could be untouched by its sin. But of course, it's impossible for them to resist. And what's really interesting is the general. The general is the only person at that table who's really used to fine dining. He's had loads of great things. He recognizes dishes. He identifies some of those wines. And of course, what's so interesting to watch him eat is that he is the exact opposite of the stereotype of the greedy pig who's a slave to his stomach. He sips, he takes his time, he notices, he observes. He notices things in the food that the Puritans don't. They get quite into it, but it's quite interesting that as they get into it, they're so unused to it. They're rather gobbling it quite a bit and licking their fingers and all this kind of stuff. He really savors it. And I think this is, again, such an important point about the role pleasure must have in a good life, because the pursuit of pleasure is often fruitless and pointless. And that's partly because pleasure doesn't last, of course. It's in time. So if you go around frantically pursuing pleasure in a kind of unskilled way, all that happens is that you're always being led back to disappointment. There's this lovely Parker poem, I quote too much maybe. It's very short, and I'll probably get it slightly wrong, but it goes roughly, let's laugh and dance and sing and joke and reel the whole night through. For tomorrow we shall surely die, but alas, we never do. And that last line, but alas, we never do, is capturing that sense that when that's all you do, you just pursue pleasure in that blind way, you're always left with the hangover, with the fact that you're empty. The next day, there's nothing left to enjoy. Now, the point is, there's no solution to that in the sense that pleasure is fleeting, it is passing, but there's a way of relating to the passing of time and to the pleasures to be found in time, which doesn't leave you unsatisfied like that. It's a pleasure which involves, for want of a better word, mindfulness. The word mindfulness, of course, is bandied around all the time now and perhaps overused, but just in the sense of attentiveness to things. And part of the attention is precisely to the way in which it goes through time. Flavor wave thing Spencer has described. When you're paying attention very carefully to taste, you notice how it changes over the brief time that it's even in your mouth. It's not just an instant that it's over. And if you're like the general and you cultivate that kind of attitude towards pleasure, pleasure does have a very valuable role in the good life as something which is impermanent, but is properly savored and therefore is properly enjoyed. And I think Japanese aesthetics, in particular the whole Japanese outlook, is really good at capturing this. They have this concept of moi no wa, which is often described as the pathos of things. And it's really about that idea of the bittersweetness of pleasure. But alongside the pleasure of anything in this temporary world is that hint of bitterness that it won't last, that it is passing. And I don't know, I don't think I'm unusual in finding that often some of the most beautiful moments and the most intense moments are precisely those where you are both deeply immersed in it and enjoying it, but also aware that it won't last. Listening to a piece of music can be like that. You know it's going to come to an end. You know it will soon be over. And that's almost why it's so wonderful, because you know you're in an intense moment. So developing that intensity of relationship with the moment while allowing it to pass, that's, I think, the secret of pleasure, actually. It's the way to enjoy pleasure properly rather than for it to be a sequence of things which leave you empty and hollow.
Yeah. It's very much the savoring that, it's like when you finish a book, I think you're sort of often very, sad that it's over, but you feel replete. And similarly, when but it's very different to, for example, playing a video game when you're just sort of trying to get to the next level. And I think that's sort of similar with food, that when you have a great craft chocolate bar, you savor it. And actually, you don't necessarily want to even eat it all in one go.
Yeah.
Because it is that mono no ware, it is that sort of, short moment when you're basically sort of trying to enjoy it. And just sort of, savoring it for what it is. And it is incredibly different from when you scoff. So, here you've got all these amazing sensations, and thank you very much for them. And they're very different to when I go to scoff it. So, here some of you did sort of, get some fruit flavors out of it, but that was because I think you basically savored it for too long. If you basically think about how you scoff lots of fast food, it's completely different. With a Pringle, you're not going to get any balance or length or intensity or complexity out of that sort of stuff. Whereas if you have a really well-crafted, food, whether it be part of Babette's feast or whether it be a great craft chocolate, you really will savor it, and it is just much more enjoyable and much better for you, etc. Right. Now we're going to go to one of your great heroes, one of my great heroes, definitely, is the amazing Mikhail Frisholm. And what we've got here is just to sort of show you the extraordinary varieties that you can get from different cacaos. So Mikhail is sort of a Great Dane. I will try and show you a picture of him. You've got the two bars here. You've got the small 70% Juno, which is a double term, which I'll talk more about in a minute, against the Hohe, I'm probably pronouncing that one wrong, which is a different bean. So let me just try and sort of just explain to you. So this is Mikhail here. He is truly a Great Dane. Julian and I have spent many an evening having fun with him, and he spent lots of time in the house. He's absolutely wonderful. He's about sort of 6'6". One of the sort of first guys inside Noma and all that sort of stuff over in Copenhagen, one of the guys behind MAD, if you're into that food festival. And what he's focused on for the last 15 of his years of his life is basically taking Nicaraguan cacao. And basically what he's got here is he's just showing you 6 different variants of cacao. So we all know how wine is different between Cabernet Sauvignon and how it's different between sort of Malbec. And you all know how different winemakers can coax different things out of it. But what Mikhail tries to do is show you how different beans and different fermentations just bring out extraordinary different flavors in the chocolate. So what you've got here is the Hoche, and then you've also got the Chuno. And you can just look at those 2 different sort of, cocoa pods, and you can see how different they are. So there is no right or wrong answer here, but it would just be fascinating to basically hear from those of you who are trying the chocolates, which ones you prefer. Is it the first one, which is the Chuno, which again, just to sort of put it in context, the Chuno is the blue one, or is it the brown one, which is the Joche? Which one do you sort of prefer, and which ones do you sort of, enjoy more of? Okay. And do savor them. And what I'll just quickly do while you're all sort of going for that is I mentioned the different, the things which give cacao its different flavor are very similar to what happens with wine. So we talked about different cocoa varietals and just as there are different grape varietals. The next thing which makes a huge difference, and this is actually where the double turn becomes relevant, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, is what we call fermentation in chocolate. So when you open a cocoa pod, it's about the same size as a rugby football. As you saw, lots of different colors. It can be lots of different flavors. Sorry, lots of different shapes too. But when you actually cut into the cocoa pod, the seeds, which are surrounded by a pulp, are incredibly bitter and incredibly astringent, even more astringent than that 100% that you had. And you really would never guess that this stuff could ever become chocolate. And what starts to make it become like chocolate is actually the process, the magic of fermentation. Because what happens is that the pulp, once it's exposed to the air and all the yeasts and all the bacteria in the air, it basically starts to create a biochemical reaction, which turns into very light alcohol. It gets very, very hot. And what it does is it actually breaks through the seed's shell, and it stops the seeds from germinating more, so they technically become beans, but it also brings out all sorts of different flavors in them. So if you actually have a cocoa bean, once it's been fermented, it will start to show you some of those chocolatey flavor notes that you would expect. You get some fruitiness, you may get some nuttiness, you'll get some vegetable notes, it'll taste a bit chocolatey, etc. And it's basically, depending on how long you ferment it for, what the yeast and bacteria are around it, but also, and this is where the double turn comes in, how many times you turn it, because the number of times you move it from one big wooden vat to another big wooden vat in the fermentation process changes dramatically the heat, and that gives it a different flavor. And Mikhail actually, with this Chuno, actually has some beans which are turned twice, and then others which are turned 3 times during the fermentation. And you wouldn't have thought something that sort of simple would make a huge difference to flavor, but it really does make the most huge difference to flavor. So there we go. So we're basically pretty much all over the place. But it's interesting just to sort of show that everybody likes different chocolate in different ways. And I'm impressed that some of you might have a split decision. But it looks to me as if the Hoche is doing slightly better than the Chuno, but you never know. But anyway, there we go. It's all good.
Just coming, Spencer, actually, because one thing interesting about this question, which do you prefer? I think it's probably worth bearing in mind that question is, it should really be, which are you preferring? Because I think one of the interesting things about any kind of like complex flavor, complex food, is that it does very much depend on all sorts of circumstances. We all know the phenomenon of how certain things taste better by the sea than they do when you're back at home. And that's partly to do with atmospheric things. The saltiness of the air somehow enhances it, or whatever it might be, depending on the temperature, depending on what you've eaten before, what you've eaten after, and all these kind of things. And I think it's this thing that, all these things are so interconnected. There is no such thing as any kind of experience which isn't linked in a network to other experiences. And so although it's true that over time there are things one tends to prefer, and has favourite wines, favourite chocolates, etc., etc. These things are never kind of absolute. And I just found myself thinking, I gave a split decision there because I found the Juno more instantly kind of enjoyable. The Jorge was kind of got to me by the end, and I thought, which one of those I most enjoy is probably going to depend a lot on perhaps what mood I'm in and perhaps how attentive I've been, etc., etc. I mean, would you agree with that? I'm not just making that up, am I?
Oh, you're definitely not making it up. I mean, one of the most interesting things is we do a lot of chocolate and wine tastings. And one of the sort of games we play is we ask people up front, okay, which of these two chocolates do you prefer? And it's generally the Pura, and it's another chocolate which is made by the same people, called the Cru Virunga, which those of you who are into chocolate will probably know it's sort of made in Africa or from African beans. And they taste radically different. And a lot of people actually prefer the Pura, which is a bit brighter. But when you ask them to have it with wine, most people actually prefer the Virunga because it's a little bit more mellow, a little bit. It's sort of somehow the tannins soften one another and work better. And actually, it is a fascinating experiment to do, is to, as you sort of said, depending on what else you've eaten, what else you're trying, where else you are, it does make a huge difference to what you are preferring at that moment. And the easiest way to do it is always to be comparing and having different things together. I mean, one of the bits of advice that we give to you at the end of this, and we always give to everybody, is always taste in pairs. Always have another person with you as you're enjoying some chocolate, but always have at least 2 chocolates on the go at any one time. And also do it with other products because it will radically just bring out different flavor profiles. And that is the whole fun of savoring it and enjoying it. So, you've got your glass of wine. I don't know which chocolate goes better with the wine, but, maybe they both bring out different aspects, but it will bring out a different dimension by having it with a different product in a different area. I think, or not. Which one do you prefer with the wine?
Oh, good question. I think the Jorge. I think.
Yeah, that's what I would have expected because it's a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's keep moving because we're only sort of about halfway through. So this is what I was talking about: the things which give rise to flavor. I talked about the different cocoa varietals, just like wine. Talked about the different fermentation. The other angle which makes a huge difference, of course, is the way in which you dry it. So chocolate grows in a belt of 0 to 20 degrees north and south of the equator, basically in rainforests, unless they've been destroyed, but where it's pretty sunny. And in most places in the world, when you dry cacao, you can just put it out in the sun and it'll dry. However, there are certain parts of the world, like Papua New Guinea or Fiji or Samoa or Indonesia, where it rains so much that you can't rely on the sun to do the drying. So you do something called fire-based drying. And often the fires which you use to dry the beans out actually have smoke which permeates those beans. And it gives it a sort of Lapsang Souchong or an Islay whiskey flavor, which some people really don't like, but other of us really do love it. So those are the 3 aspects, which really make a difference to flavor on the farm. The last thing I would just like to give you, just as a useless bit of dinner party conversation, is that most of you probably know that chocolate grows on trees. And in fact, it's where the expression money doesn't grow on trees, but chocolate does actually sort of comes from, which is that cocoa was so valuable to the Aztecs that they actually used it as a source of currency, which is where the expression came from. But what you may not realize is where it grows on the tree. So most fruits, if you think about it, grow, out the branches, out the top, like a pineapple, some of them out the roots. Very, very, very few actually grow out the trunk of a tree. There is actually a whole genus called Coliferous, which do like this. And cacao chocolate is probably the only product most of you will ever have, which grows like this. If you ever go to Southeast Asia, you may try the durian or the jackfruit. If you do, that's the other fruit that most people know, which comes out the trunk of the tree. But it is a pretty extraordinary fruit in lots of different ways. And you can sort of see there some lovely pods sort of, and some lovely little sort of flowers shooting out the tree. And those little sort of spurts become the cocoa pods, which we then sort of benefit from. Right. And then the other stuff which makes a difference to the flavor we sort of talked about is it's the roasting, it's when you crack and winnow it, it's the grinding, which we talked about, the tempering, which we'll come back to, etc. Those are the other things. But basically, the maker's big control is to work with the farmers in terms of choosing the right beans and getting the right fermentation. But then it's all up to them in terms of what they roast, how long they grind, how they conch for, what recipes they use, and how they temper. So on that sort of, that's a little bit about the chocolate making. Now let's talk a bit more about Babette's feast and how she makes just the most extraordinary dishes in this meal.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to talk about that so much, actually, because I think we talked quite a lot about the art and everything. But instead, just take this as an interesting picture of this is a quail in sarcophages. So this is it's like a memento mori, and I think it goes back to that again, that idea of the bittersweetness of pleasure appropriately taken. This is a dish that, as you eat it, is actually the very name is reminding you of death. And I think this is what makes we save a life more when we are actually aware of death. But I actually do want to pick up though on something we haven't talked about so much, which people will be aware of, about, and it's come up a few times in the presentation earlier on. We talk about these wonderful Quaker families who built these model factories for their employees. But of course, the cacao was coming from slaves, as the slaves were picking it. And unfortunately, today, there's still a lot of exploitation in the cacao supply chain. There's a lot of child labor. I think this is a slightly controversial topic. Spencer's got some very strong views about it, and I've spoken to other people who also deeply in the chocolate world who perhaps don't agree entirely. So I think this is something that is somewhat contested. I think Spencer would go as far as to say that if you buy a kind of random chocolate bar, you could almost guarantee there'll be some child labor there somewhere along the line. And of course, this is something that does concern us. And I remember having a very interesting conversation with Friis Holm when I was lucky enough to be in Denmark, actually, about this. And he was actually really cross about fair trade. And this is something I found is quite common to a lot of people in the craft chocolate world, are quite cross about fair trade. And the reason is this: if you push them on it, well, again, different views. Some of them just think there's virtually nothing good to be said about it. Others will say it's better than nothing. But the key point is this: fair trade gives a little bit extra, a little tiny premium to the buyers. That's true. What craft chocolate does almost invariably is it pays a premium price, a real premium price for this great cacao. And people can make a really good living, we hope. And a lot of people who are into this are really, that they would say that as their motivation. I can't remember now the American guy, Spencer, who I met.
Brad,
yeah. What's his company?
He set up something called Made in Africa, MIA, but beforehand he worked with Madras.
That's why they get into it, because it's the motivation is to give that farmer the fair price. And I think there are some interesting things about this. So the first thing is that most of us, I think, would claim we are concerned about these things. We want to do something about it. But information, without proper information and understanding, there's a limit to what you can do. You can buy something with a fair trade logo on it, sure, and all that kind of thing. But what kind of saddens me is when people will buy something with a fair trade logo on it, but they won't buy a craft chocolate because there isn't a fair trade logo on it. Fair trade is a certification scheme. It's not the gold standard for ethical production. It's a kind of very minimal standard, actually. So although I've been a big supporter of fair trade over the years, and I wouldn't want to knock it, the idea that if it doesn't have the fair trade label, it is not fairly traded, is an absolute mistake. So there's real important to find things out. Kant wrote this famous essay, What is Enlightenment? And he says there that it's dare to know. That's the real thing. Find out for yourself. That's the key to making good decisions and wise decisions. So know more about it and understand what really constitutes fair trade. But I think what interests me even more is how things like this affect the pleasure of eating. I mean, I think that, if I were to give you something really tasty, maybe superficially tasty, you start to eat it. And then as I say, that was made by child laborers. It would probably begin to taste sour in your mouth in some way. You wouldn't be enjoying it as much, right? Now, that's not the power of suggestion. Some people say, oh, this shows how you can manipulate people's minds to make them think differently. It's not that. It's because actually all our experiences, even sensory runs, are connected to what we think, what we believe, and our values. So it's not that the mind is playing tricks on us. It's that our physical pleasures are always tied up with beliefs, values, and all these things. So for me, it's not just a matter of I want to eat chocolate where I can be pretty sure that the growers have been given a good deal because it makes me feel good. It makes the experience of eating it better. It makes it more enjoyable. It makes it, well, if you feel any guilt about these things, which I don't tend to be honest, it takes away that kind of guilt. So I think it's really important to appreciate how the pleasure we take in food should and is rightly connected with knowledge where it comes from. Just one final example of this, which is not chocolate, is eggs. People say that, free range eggs taste better than battery eggs. Well, actually in blind tastings, it's often not the case. In blind tastings, most people can't tell the difference. I mean, there are some astonishing sort of really prestige high-end eggs like cackle bean eggs. If you ever try them, they're really, really good. They're just evidently superior. But generally speaking, most people can't tell the difference between a random battery hen egg and a farm egg. But does that mean it's false when people say those eggs taste better? Well, no, because knowing that it's from a free-range farm makes it taste better. It actually makes it taste better. It doesn't trick you into think it's tasting better. It does taste better. So, you enjoy your food more when you're confident about where it's come from, which is also why, of course, we enjoy food a lot when it's been prepared for us, when it's been prepared with love for us or with consideration. It's also perhaps one reason why open plan kitchens have become more important in restaurants until they've all got hit by this darn virus. When you see that connection with the person cooking it, you enjoy it more. So this general idea has come up in various different forms during this talk, that eating isn't just an animal pleasure. It's something we bring our minds and our knowledge and our awareness to.
Yeah, so I think we want you to eat lots more chocolate, but I think Julian's absolutely spot on there. I'm going to try and make a couple more points just on that one. And then you're going to talk a bit more about, we've talked a bit about this one, but let me stop just for a second. Let me just reply very quickly to two comments which Julian made. So on fair trade in chocolate, we get asked a lot about this, and I think there's 2 or 3 fundamental points to it, and Julian's spot on. So the first thing is that fair trade was designed for what we would sort of call plantation crops. So things like bananas and things like pineapples, which are grown massively at scale, and where actually the small premium that fair trade pays to them does make a massive difference because of the way in which it works. And the certification cost is one that can be afforded. In the case of chocolate, fair trade really just, it's not that it doesn't help at all. It's just, it's not really designed for chocolate because, and here's the reason why. So the first thing is that the average West African cocoa farmer gets paid less than 90 cents a day. They need about $2.50, $3 a day to live on. And basically the fair trade premium is at best 10 or 20%. So it's better than nothing, but it's really not addressing the root cause of the problem. The second problem is that they actually can't afford certification most of the point. And it's similar with organic, because those are designed for people who have big farms. The average cocoa farmer in West Africa has got less than 10 hectares, and most of them are actually 1 to 2 hectares. And the balance of supply is such that there's 10 or so chocolate companies who control 80% of all the chocolate purchased in West Africa, which is 70% of the world's cacao, and there's about 2 million farmers. And so, all the farmers can do is just basically compete with one another on price and how much they can grow. And that's where I think that the fair trade, in a sense, misses the essential point of where cacao's real value lies. If you look at what's happened with specialty coffee, people are now willing to pay a bit more for coffee. And the same is true of even things like craft beer. And the reason for that is they get the fact that if you pay a little bit more and you get really good ingredients, which are really well fermented, it is worth it. Because, if you spend 10 to 15 quid on a great bottle of wine crafted by, like the lady who helped us, Rebecca, from Corney and Barrow, basically, if you basically go to her and say, look, I've got 10 or 15 pounds, she'll get you an amazing wine. But you can't do that with sort of bulk wines, which are being sold for 3 or 4 quid. It's just not going to be the same thing. Now, the great thing about chocolate is that actually it is worth paying a premium for great chocolate because it will taste awesome. The most irritating thing to us in the world of craft chocolate is that it is this point that actually, if you're willing to just spend 3, 4, 5, maybe £6, maybe a tiny bit more, Mikhail's bars are huge and they're at night, 8 to 10 pounds, but they're very big. They'll last you for a couple of weeks, but you are getting the equivalent of 100 quid bottle of wine for that. And what's more, that the farmers are being encouraged to preserve the rainforest. They're getting paid way more than they would ever get if they're getting paid fair trade, and they're encouraged to carry on growing this stuff. So it's a sort of win for everybody. It tastes better. It's better for you because you're not scoffing it and it's not full of all sorts of junk. And it's much, much, much better for the planet and for the farmers overall. And it's better for you. So it really is a sort of win-win. And that's the reason why actually thinking a little bit more about your food is the important thing. Just looking at the certification, nobody has ever worked out how to get people to pay that much more of a premium. It's not enough. What you actually want people to do is to pay for the quality which they can perceive. And that means that chocolate shouldn't be just seen as an ingredient or as a flavor vector for other products. Right. Anyway, I think we're getting lots of questions, but I'm basically going to just see if we need to sort of chat or any about those. We will get them and have more of them later as we go on. But I mean, look, I love this movie, and I'm incredibly grateful to you, Julian, because I actually hadn't. I'm embarrassed to say that before we agreed to do these talks, I actually knew all about this, but I've never watched it. And I loved reading your book too. So here you go. That's my sort of PN to you to tell you more about the book and more about the amazing feast that goes through. And I mean, or we can sort of, carry on.
No, except just carry on, because I think that this slide was intended for what I said earlier, and this is I do like this slightly, but here, I will say something about this. This is one of my favourite moments. This is a fantastic face, isn't it? This is a guy who is a servant, really, and behind the scenes at the feast, he's allowed to share the same food that other people are getting there, and he is just sort of absolutely stunned by it. And I think that what you kind of get conveyed in the film, I think very subtly, really, is I think there's a certain kind of sacredness of the everyday. If you excuse me not sounding too pretentious, I probably sounded pretentious for the whole evening. I think that what kind of the Babette's Feast, one of the many, many things Babette's Feast does, is that it's sorry, I've got a cat who probably wants to be let out in a minute, is that it tells us something about how really to relate to the material, temporal, impermanent world with the same kind of reverence that some people reserve for the eternal. It's the idea that the sacred can be found here and now, not elsewhere. So one of the things, there's one comment that a music teacher says to his protege, who is one of the sisters who becomes a Puritan. She has this beautiful singing voice, and she says, in heaven you will make everybody, the angels, weep with your voice or something. And the sisters say to the Babette after the feast, in heaven you will make the angels. She says the same phrase comes back. The sister is repeating the line that was said to her when she was a singer as a young girl, as an older woman, to Babette. But of course, there's an irony there, because what the film is really showing is that you don't have to wait to heaven for that. If the singing, a beautiful singing voice or fantastic cooking is worthy of the angels, well, actually, it's here now in the everyday. And so I think that there is actually in the film, it's not an anti-religious film, actually, but it's trying to bring that religious sensibility and that kind of reverence from the clouds, from the heavens, really down to earth. And so like this person here, you can have an experience of eating. And, we'd say, don't we, it was divine. It was divine. We use that as a word. And in a way, the suggestion is we should take that more literally than we normally do. It's not just a kind of a metaphor. There's something really true about that.
Yeah, no, I think going back to your sort of Japanese analogies now, I think that the sort of the Shintoist approach to just delighting in what you can do and sort of seeing it in nature is sort of, typical of that. And it is the reason why actually the Japanese make some of the world's best craft chocolate and are some of the most avid consumers. I mean, Mikhail is, a cult figure in Europe, but when he goes to Japan, he is literally mobbed. It is really quite funny because he's a big guy and they're quite delicate. But anyway, right. And back to trying, so here we sort of go. So any of you allergic to milk, I'm afraid this is not a chocolate bar you will be able to enjoy, but this is just basically showing you that how even great milk chocolates can exist. And just enjoy it. There's nothing, everybody sort of says, there are lots of purists who sort of say, oh, it's only dark chocolate that you should have. That's like saying it's only 100% chocolate you should have. Look, lots of people love 100%. It's absolutely amazing. Lots of people love dark chocolate. I love dark chocolate, but I also think milk chocolate is absolutely brilliant. So dig into your, this isn't even a guilty pleasure. This is something you should really, really savor. This is what Brett, the guy you were talking about, this is the stuff that's 5 times better than fair trade, because not only is it grown in Madagascar, it's also crafted in Madagascar by Shahin, and it's just an amazing bar. So just, get back onto menti.com, tell us what you're enjoying, and then we'll give you the tricks that they've used to show what it is. So let's just sort of see what you think of it. And there is one particular word that I'm actually looking for in it, which I will use to explain a little bit more in just a sec what it is. But there's a particular flavor profile to this, which I really want to see how many people sort of get. And yes, it's up there. You've all got it immediately, which is, you're all very good. So the word I'm looking for actually is caramel. So sugar and chocolate. So everybody at the moment demonizes sugar. So we don't actually have this as a slide, but we often put it in now, which is that if I asked you, what do you think's got more sugar? a low-fat vanilla yogurt, 1 pot, a 70% dark chocolate, or this milk chocolate that you're having, and I asked you which has got more added sugar, I think most of you would probably start with the milk chocolate. But actually, you'd be wrong. The product which has got the most added sugar to it is the low-fat vanilla yogurt, because they're using it as a stabilizer. And actually, when you get like a 50% milk chocolate, which we have lots of, or even a 45% and like a 65, 70% dark chocolate, they've actually got about the same amount of sugar, because what's happening is that you're using the milk to sweeten it, because you caramelize it. You add the milk when you're grinding it and you're conching it, which is the very high temperature, and it, like milk caramelizes, that's how you make it sweet. That's what you're getting here. The other thing just to realize is that, when you get one of these bars, this is actually Menacal's 63% chocolate, which actually does have less added sugar than their 44% milk. But even this has only got 2 teaspoons of sugar. And that's if you ate the whole load of it, or less than 2 teaspoons of sugar. Comparison, a low-fat vanilla yogurt, the average one has got like 3 or 4 in it. So the sugar thing is a bit of a red herring in the case of good craft chocolate, because it's just like a little bit of salt brings out the flavor of meat. That's what you're using with the chocolate. There's not really that much in it. Okay, so brilliant. You've all got that one. Right, now, well, we sort of talked about this earlier on. This is basically the reason why you have the grainy chocolate, which we had earlier on, the Taza. This is just showing you how it gets made. This is your Indian lentil grinders. And what actually happens here is that you basically drop the chocolate in, and you can sort of see this has got a completely different texture. So this is what the Swiss basically did to chocolate, adding in the milk powder at this point too, and then getting these great milk chocolates. Right, so we're now going to try the Pump Street Madagascar milk. And this again will have way less sugar in it than your average low-fat vanilla yogurt, and the most 70% dark chocolate, well, than any 70% dark chocolate too. So savor that, and while you're savoring it, let me try and ruin it for you by asking you, just as a sort of quick humorous aside, to tell us what you think of a bar of Hershey's milk chocolate. What does that smell of to you? And please do not confuse it with the Pump Street chocolate that we're getting you to try. There is a particular erg. Yes, that's good. Ah, you've got it. The person who said sick. Well done. Take a round of applause. Yes. So one of the things that we're very, very keen on getting you all to do with chocolate going forward, puke. Yes, absolutely spot on. What you may not realize is that the Americans actually, and we may also see waxy coming up here. You may not realize this, but one of the things that you should always do with chocolate going forward is you should always look at the ingredients list. And you should look at 3 things. You should first of all check the ingredients. Then you should basically try and check where the beans come from, because otherwise you're just going to be using, as Julian sort of said, stuff that you don't know if it's destroying the environment, you don't know if it's using child slave labor or anything. The only way you can guarantee that it isn't, because we don't have any other certification, is to know where the beans come from. So whenever we sell a bar, we always know not just where it's made, but also where the beans are from. But anyway, back onto Hershey's and what they do. So one of the most extraordinary things that the Americans do to their milk chocolates is they add something called butyric acid to it. So for those of you who are biochemists, you're probably aware of the fact that butyric acid is that wonderful substance which gives Parmesan cheese its delicious flavor. But it's also the same thing that happens when a baby pukes up its mother's milk. That is the curdled milk from, whatever it is, from its stomach coming back out. Interestingly, butyric acid also is produced in your underarms when you sweat. But it is generally not something which you would think you'd want to add to a food unless it's Parmesan. Yet the Americans do this. And Hershey's in particular is sort of renowned for doing it. So the question is why? And there are lots of different stories. One of them is that Hershey's basically knocked off what Lindt and Nestle were doing, and Daniel Peter was doing in the turn of the century, but didn't realize that you actually had to stop the milk going off before you added it to the chocolate. There is then another story which Hershey's have got, which is that because they had to transport their milk for such longer distances, they had to sort of make it slightly curdled to make it survive those distances, which to me makes absolutely no sense because anyway, but that's the story they give. But the most bizarre thing is that Americans now love that, what they call a sort of tangy, acrid flavor. And they literally now add butyric acid to all of their chocolates, which is really, really odd. And it just, the reason why I was saying it though is just please, please, please do always look at the ingredients, and it's incredibly important. Right. I think we're on to the next slide. We're now going to say thanks, I think.
Yeah, I think we are just going to say thanks, actually, because it's really bizarre. I seem to be sort of talking about the next slide on the previous slide, because this is a person giving thanks to Babette. And what Babette does is she transforms the everyday experience of the people she comes into contact with. And I think this is such an important thing, because the Puritanism which says don't pursue these things, don't enjoy these pleasurable things, it's actually robbing from people experiences which can only make their lives better. And as I say, the thing is that Babette does this without having to increase the budget. Now, this may seem an ironic thing when you're talking about craft chocolate, because craft chocolate, there's no getting away from it. It is expensive compared to ordinary chocolate. And the markups is significantly more, I think. If you were to go to a Costa Coffee, or you were to go to somewhere like Prufrock's, for example, I mean, actually, you probably pay for similar prices. Yep. In fact, you'll pay more for a Costa on the motorway than you will for a Prufrock on Leather Lane, depending where you go. Wine, you can get more wine by spending a little bit more, but the multiplier effect with chocolate is a lot more. But at the same time, then you've got to ask yourself, yes, but in absolute terms, is it a lot of money? And it isn't. Less than the price of a bottle of wine, probably the price of around 2 takeaway coffees. And because it's so dense and rich in flavor, it is entirely true that you simply don't want to eat it all in one go. You really do savor it. You have a few pieces at a time, and it's so rich and so delicious. This, how it does relate to what Babette does in the film. The sisters provide food to the poor of the village. It's tasteless, horrible food. The villagers are very grateful for it, but it gives them no joy. It's keeping them alive, but they're not really living. And that's the real point. It reduces food to fuel, essentially. Babette transforms it into something else. She transforms it into something which brings joy. It lightens the life of people whose lives are really hard. And that's why this poor man is praying and is thanking God for giving them Babette. And you would, if you believed in God, you'd thank God for that. And I think that, again, I don't want to sort of say the message of the film. It's not even messages, actually. We're shown things. We learn the lessons for ourselves. It's not that kind of heavy-handed didactic film. But one of the things I think the film really shows us is just how transformative, how everyday experience can and should be enriched if we take the right attitude to pleasure and enjoyment. And it's not about selfishness either, actually. That's the other interesting thing as well. Of course, because Babette's great feast is something she prepares for other people. She doesn't eat it herself. I mean, she is having little samples. She doesn't even have a sip of the wine. Remember, she hasn't had any, she's a chef who must have knocked back a fair amount in her time. She doesn't even have a sip of the wine until she's finished serving it. She gives away. And, good food is exactly that same way. Spencer was saying earlier how you should always do things in twos. Eat with somebody else and have 2 bars. You can't always do that, especially in lockdown. There were people by themselves and everything, in which case really enjoy it by yourself, right? And do. But, gift it to someone, share it with someone. That's what we do with good food. Isn't it telling, I think, that when you have something really nice, your first impulse is to go, try this. It is about sharing. It is about being together with other people. Whereas actually that's the opposite of a lot of like convenience food and cheap food. It's something people scoff alone. The TV dinners where every member of the family has something different. So it's not about selfish greediness and material. It's about expansiveness, conviviality, and sharing too. I think I've sounded, it's probably my last sort of intervention like this from the evening. I probably sounded very sort of evangelical about food. And I think in Britain in particular, there is that kind of suspicion that if you talk about food in this way, you're being pretentious. If I was French, I could do this. If I was Japanese, I could do it probably, actually. Michael Friesholm, I could get worshipped maybe. But in Britain, there's some embarrassment about that. I think it's to do with our Protestant, somewhat puritanical background. I make no apology for talking about food in terms which perhaps you might be more used to people talking about religion and so forth, because it's the preciousness of the reverence for life, the preciousness of the everyday, and the miracle of living. I mean, it's there in front of you for £6.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, just to sort of enhance what you're saying, I mean, it's very rare you find a product which we spend more on than we do on books or on music combined, and chocolate is one of them. And yet 99.9% of the chocolate we eat isn't very good for us. It's not very good for the farmers. It's not very good for the planet. And it's something which we we almost sort of see as like being a sort of guilty, you know, little sort of self-indulgence or something. But actually chocolate shouldn't be like that. Chocolate is one of the great pleasures in life. It's one of the most amazing foods in terms of its different flavor compounds. And if you want to make a difference, do something better for you, do something better for the farmers. It's really easy. Just eat slightly better chocolate, which costs a little bit more, but it's not that much more. I mean, you know, our subscription's 20 quid a month. It's 4 bars. That's enough for a couple for a month. And on top of that, you know, it's, you know, it's such an easy change to make. I'm not so, you know, so, I mean, yeah. And I think just getting into savoring food is just hugely important. Getting to read the ingredients on everything you do, you know where everything comes from. Knowing how to savor is just going to be better for everybody. Right. There is one last chocolate, which I think we just want you to all sort of enjoy and savor, which is the Menacao Salt and Nibs. So just sort of eat that while we do the quiz.